Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for being here this morning. It's so lovely to see your bright and chipper faces. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Darkinjung people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and of course extend that respect to any First Nations peoples who may be with us this morning. Welcome to Shaping Australia. Today we're going to consider a few of the many ways to be Australian through the work of three incredible authors. So I'll introduce them to you now. So, to my immediate left, Om Dhungel is the author of Bhutan to Blacktown. He arrived in Australia as a student in 1998 before being granted a refugee visa. Om played a critical role in the settlement of 5,000 Bhutanese refugees in Australia. He worked for 10 years as a business analyst, and today he sits on the New South Wales Police Multicultural Advisory Council and the board of the Asylum Seeker Centre. Then, in the middle, we have Shankari Chandran. She is the author of three incredible novels. Song of the Sun God and Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens both came out in Australia in 2022, so it was a very busy year for her, and that continues this year. And her earlier novel, The Barrier, came out in 2017. Song of the Sun God is currently being adapted for television, and Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens was recently longlisted for the Miles Franklin, so huge congratulations. We're looking forward to more great things from her. And then, at the far end, Ryan Butta is the author of the nonfiction work, The Ballad of Abdul Wade. He grew up in regional New South Wales and currently lives in Kiama. And he is a writer and editor and also authors the Out of Office newsletter. So welcome to all three of our panelists. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to talk with them about their amazing work. Now remember, you can get a copy of each of their books after the panel and have them sign it, so your chance to have a chat with them and get a signed copy of the book. Signed books make the best gifts if you need to get a gift for anyone at the moment. And we'll have 10 minutes for questions at the end. So please, if you've got questions that you're keen to hear these authors' thoughts on, save them for that time. And I know, it can always be a little bit tricky sometimes to be the first person to ask a question and get things started. So I have got a signed copy of my memoir, How to Be Australian. So for the first person who asks the question, you're gonna get this. So get ready. All right, now, I'd just like to start with a little something from Om's book. He notes that nearly 4 million migrants, which is almost 1 in 6 of the Australian population, have come to this country in the past 25 years. And in Blacktown, where he lives, in Western Sydney, Om lives among people from 188 countries. So it's one of the most multicultural communities in Australia and probably in the world. And there have been multicultural communities throughout history. Like, this is nothing new. I mean, we can look at the Ottoman Empire, which extended across 3 continents. But I think it's only in the past 100 years that we've really had this extraordinary opportunity to live among people from literally every single part of the world. The number of cultures represented just by the 4 of us, right now on stage is pretty incredible. And I think this is something that we really don't celebrate enough. Like, we really should celebrate it more. And I'm so glad that your book has given us a reason to acknowledge that, so thank you. So I want to get started with Om's book. And I just want to ask everyone here, who's heard of gross national happiness, the concept of gross national happiness? Okay, quite a lot of the audience. All right, excellent. So then, following on from that, who has heard of the Kingdom of Bhutan's ethnic cleansing initiative? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people in the audience. So I think that's really demonstrative of sort of, I want to say, the marketing that the Kingdom of Bhutan has done. So you're going to hear about a different side of the country today. So can you please introduce the book Bhutan to Blacktown for our audience? What's it about, and how did you come to write it? And how does it relate to those questions we just asked?
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you for that warm introduction. And we're going to promise that we're not going to cry today on this stage.
Well, there were some tears last night.
Thank you. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where we are meeting today and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I always remember Uncle Wes in Blacktown. He turned 102, I think now. He wrote a book when he was 99. And Uncle Wes, in his welcome, always said, "Welcome to the circle." And I feel so privileged to be welcome to the circle. So thank you. Thank you. And I feel really privileged to be sitting amongst this very esteemed colleagues here. I'm a, what I call it, when you first start, I'm a almost, what's the word? Apprentice kind of thing. Because here's Shankari, 3 books, and Ryan, how many books? Okay, we're together.
Fellow apprentice.
This is my search, first search sort of, literary sort of event here, so thank you for having me. Yes, a couple of reasons why I wrote the book and what's in the book. One of the reasons, it goes back to one of my one of the professors at Western Sydney University. He always said, I've been talking about the way you guys settle, and how you have been, working with other refugees, people from other communities, and helping to settle refugees in this country. I've been telling this all the time, but people keep asking me, so why don't you write a book so that I can pass on the book and make it easier for people to understand? So that was one of the reasons I think I wanted to write the book. And the book is about, again, my journey from, growing up, born and brought up, and growing up in Bhutan, what was then the poorest country in the world. That was officially, at that time, it was the poorest country in the world. And now having, been forced to flee the country, I had to flee the country, leaving behind my wife and a 2-year-old daughter. And I'm really blessed to have my wife here taking photos today. It is that journey, I don't think I can put that into words, like to have, to leave a wife that you have met just, 2-3 years ago, and never knowing I would ever see them again. I had to kiss goodbye to my little daughter, 2-year-old daughter, and leave the country. And having left that and spent, 6 years in, Nepal as a refugee, helping people to settle in the country, help set up, schools and hospitals and a refugee camp, and then fleeing again, having that dream to do an MBA and coming to Australia in 1998 and, starting a new life all over again when my wife and daughter were able to join me 3 years later. So that's that journey of growing up in that, poorest country in the world, but also a country that espouses gross national happiness, and then living that life in Nepal for 6 years, and then now starting a new life all over here in Australia. So thank you, Australia.
And have you ever been able to go back to Bhutan since then?
No, unfortunately, I'm more wanted there, so I won't be able to go back. But we are pushing the government to sort of see how, Bhutan would allow us to go back to Bhutan as Australians.
Yeah, thank you. We'll talk more about that. So, Shankari, your work has a lot of interesting connections with Oms, though you're working in fiction. Tell us about your 2 most recent novels, Chai Time and Sun God.
Thanks, Ashley. I've just got to swallow, because that's a very overwhelming story, Om. And I wanted to add to your introduction about Australia being multicultural and Blacktown having 180 people from 180 countries. The thing that we often forget to really celebrate, I think, and I'm only really learning this more and more every day, one of the many things we forget to celebrate and recognize is that before European colonization of Australia, it was one of the most diverse and multicultural land masses in the world, some 300 nations and countries and languages and cultures and belief systems, which I think is really extraordinary and something that we should be proud of our past and something we should take into the future. So on to my books. Thank you for asking me. Song of the Sun God is about 3 generations of Australian Tamil women and the choices that they make to survive Sri Lanka's recent civil war. So it's about what it is that forces many Australians to leave home and then the challenges they face in creating home here. I wrote it, I often talk about it as my motivations for the book being about wanting to prosecute the human rights and injustices that took place in Sri Lanka during that genocide. Many of those injustices are hidden and will never be adjudicated by an international court, or certainly never a Sri Lankan court. And so I talk about wanting to record that history, not necessarily to bring justice, because there's no way to bring justice to the living or the dead, but at the very least to remember it. But a big part of the motivation for writing that novel was also that when I came back from London, after 10 years in London, to Australia with my young family, 4 children, really excited to bring them back home, to my home, Australia, I just felt that I could not see people of colour, I couldn't see Sri Lankan Tamils or South Asians anywhere in our public spaces, in places of power. I could see us on the streets, in the suburbs, Strathfield, Homebush, if anyone knows, the western suburbs of Sydney, Blacktown, we're all over Blacktown. But we wouldn't. Yes, that's right. Go Sri Lanka. But we were nowhere in places of power, in places of leadership, in arts, culture, media, corporations, in the sort of senior echelons. And I thought, well, I'm here. We're here. We are Australian. Our culture is valid. We are part of the Australian story. And I really wanted to write myself for my children initially into that Australian story and into that cultural landscape to show them what it means to be Australian, Sri Lankan, Tamil. My second novel, just very quickly, was an evolution of that, really, because if my first novel was my love letter to my ancestral homeland, then my second novel was my love letter to my chosen homeland, Australia. And it's set in a nursing home in Western Sydney, where, against the backdrop of rising racism in contemporary Australia, where the residents and the staff use storytelling to try to remember their culture, to create community through storytelling, against the sort of forces of aging and colonization and dispossession, and in telling stories, how we tell the story of Australia and what it means to be Australian and who gets to tell that story.
Thank you so much. And I think one of the things that you've really touched on there that's so important to this conversation today is the multifaceted and complex nature of home, like for so many people. So thank you. Okay, Ryan, really interesting addition to this panel because you have written a revisionist history of a fascinating aspect of Australian life in the 1800s, and it brings out some really great insights into Australian mythology. So who were Abdul Wade and Gunny Khan, and what led you to write a book about them?
Thanks, Ashley. Abdul Wade and Gunny Khan were 2 men from Afghanistan that came out to Australia in the 1880s. And from very humble beginnings, we don't know when Gunny Khan actually got here, but Abdul Wade came out as an indentured labourer to milk cows. And 10 years later, he was probably the leading entrepreneur in the transport industry in Australia, and most of the wool that was carted out of Queensland and New South Wales down to Sydney was on the back of camels owned by Abdul Wade. I came across the story because I'm from that region of Australia. My family started out just this side of Bourke, a town called Brewarrina, and I came across a picture in the Brewarrina Historical Society books of these camels, like 100 camels lined up down a street of Brewarrina in the 1890s, and I just thought, what are these camels doing here? I'd never heard this story. And when I spoke to the people at the Brewarrina Information Centre, they said, you need to go to Bourke. That's where the Afghan camp was. Something an Afghan camp. And sure enough, there was like a couple of thousand Afghans in New South Wales. They were in Western Australia and South Australia. And I should say they used the term Afghans, but they weren't all Afghans. There were very few from Afghanistan. They're actually men from modern-day India and modern-day Pakistan, but they were all called Afghans, probably for ease, because they were identified more through their tribal groups than any sort of Western ideas of nation state at that stage. And so I started to read about Abdul Wade, and there's a big exhibition out there at Bourke, and it said he was a villain, he was a very nefarious character, he starved his employees and he exploited men. There were stories of conflict between Abdul's men and the white bullock drivers, camels being thrown off the bridge into the Darling River, Afghan men walking through the streets of Bourke with revolvers and shotguns, threatened to shoot any Englishmen they saw who touched their camels. So for someone trying to write a story, I thought, this sounds pretty interesting. But then I was a little bit disappointed because when I went back to the newspapers of the day, the story was completely different. And that Abdul wasn't this villain. He was a highly respected businessman. He was in partnership with Dalgetty's, the most respected pastoral company at the time. One of his business partners was the Premier of Queensland. And so rather than the story in the modern stories of the Afghans, there's a few books, there's not that many. The modern story is that they were outcasts, they lived on the edge of society, almost in an apartheid type situation. But it just wasn't true. You know, these men were front and centre of the wool industry in the colonial, in New South Wales in the colonial times. So more I dug into that story, I also started to see the story of the white British settlers at that time. And it was a very different story to the one we've been given of the ingeniousness, the resourcefulness, and the mateship. And so I thought it was a story that needed to be told, but what I really wanted to do with the book was to recognise and acknowledge the contribution that people that aren't white have made to Australia. So we have this sort of British nation-building myth, I think. So I wanted to, and Abdul considered himself an Australian. He was a naturalised Australian. And I wanted to put him back in his spot in history, in Australian history, where I think he deserves a spot for everything that he achieved. So that was my attempt with the book.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story that involves murder and injustice and assassinations, and really you could have been on a true crime panel today. But we're going to get into more of the what you discovered in terms of what it is to be Australian. We'll get back to that. Can you tell us a bit about your relationship to Australia? How has it developed over your lifetime? So what was your earliest, opinion of Australia, and how has that evolved since you've lived here?
I actually first heard about Australia when I was around 10, 11. There was a calf, brought into the village for auction. And we knew the administrator there, and he was very close to my dad. And the administrator said, this calf is a one hell of a calf. You should auction for it. You should buy this. And it cost, I still remember, we use equivalent Indian rupees, and it cost us 310 rupees. You could buy maybe 2-3 different cows with that amount of money. And my dad paid 310 rupees, and everybody thought that this man is crazy.
This was the Ferrari of cows.
Yes. And it was a Australian Jersey cow. And when he, gave birth to a calf, like it was this big, and we had a little bucket, to milk cows. And my dad started milking the cow. We all are watching because, he filled the bucket and then we had to pour into something else, fill the bucket again, 3 buckets. So that was the first experience with Australia and an Australian cow. And we had that cow for years and years. It was called Go-To Guy. And Go-To, and my co-author, James, called it's a go-to guy, a go-to cow. So, that was my first experience. And I think afterwards, when I worked in telecommunications in Bhutan, I was the head of planning and development, and we were developing a master plan. And that's when we sought some expertise from Telecom Australia, which then became Telstra. So we had quite a few people, experts coming from Telstra, Telecom Australia, then to work for us to develop our master plan. So that was one of my first sort of experience.
And at that time, in your early life, did you ever imagine, moving permanently away from the country where you were born? Did you ever imagine that you might live in Australia one day?
Yeah, that's where I think those days, I would never ever think of living anywhere but Bhutan, my own little village, because I used to travel quite a bit, go to different countries and come back. So at that point in time, never ever thought of that. Even when I sort of came here and did my master's, and I didn't have anywhere to go, but still I was hoping maybe one day I would be able to go back home. But then, fate had it that I would be living in this country, and it's a blessing for me, and I feel I get up every day in the morning and say thank you, Australia, because not every, there are over 30 million refugees today, and who wouldn't like to come to live in a country like Australia? So I feel that I'm very blessed to do that, and I have a responsibility to do a lot more than looking after myself, so that's what I'm in a mission now.
Thank you. Shankari, how has writing about Australia shaped your relationship with your own Australian identity?
So I feel that for a lot of us, writing is therapy, right? It's cathartic and therapeutic, and it's how we understand and process the world. And for me, when I first came back to Australia from 10 years in London, where being British Asian actually meant something, and that British Asian or culture contributed to the greater British culture. And of course now in Britain there's a a South Asian prime minister, which the entire global diaspora and no doubt India is thrilled about. But it was, coming back here, being able to write about Australia initially, and in particular initially about the migrant experience, helped me reclaim confidence in my right to be here and in the value and the contribution that my hybrid identity had given me, and that hybrid identity could contribute to Australian life. Because I think often throughout my childhood and my life I had felt and or been made to feel as though we were on the margins of Australian society, and that Australia was a white country and a white society for white people, and that we had been allowed in, and that we should be extremely grateful for this. And I am extremely grateful, as Om is. I sort of don't wake up every morning and say thank you for being in Australia. It's usually waking up every morning and wondering which child needs to be fed first. But I am incredibly grateful for the refuge and the life and the safety and the security that being here has given us. And going back to Sri Lanka, as I do for research or working with our own community in Australia and so on, I'm deeply aware of the choices that my parents made that gave us that life and the alternative life in a civil war that we could have had, and the way that has devastated the Tamil community there and indeed around the world. So writing has helped me understand the richness of my own Tamil identity and its place in Australia, and feel confident to assert it. And so then by the time I came to write the Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens, I'd always been afraid to talk about race or write about race in Australia, except amongst, and please excuse this expression, but I'll use it anyway, except amongst my own brown friends. So my cousins and people of colour, we have these conversations about you guys. We have these conversations about colour and what it means to be a person of colour in this country that we don't really have with people outside those communities. And part of that is around safety and the feeling of whether or not we have the right to say it, and does it undermine the impression that we want you to know that we are grateful, and so on. So we don't have those conversations with you. And when I came to write Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens, initially I thought I'd write a whimsical story set in a nursing home about quirky characters and the things, the antics that they get up to. And then I thought, actually, what I really want to do and have always wanted to do and am now ready to do is to write about race and the way that identity and race is positioned within a country that often can still cling to its whiteness. And I wanted to question why we assert that whiteness so aggressively at times. And I wanted to do that through fiction and storytelling and through an exploration of my own place in Australia.
Oh, that is such a fantastic response, because we're going to flow right into asking Ryan. You declare in your book, the fair go never existed in Australia. So give us some insight into what led to that conclusion.
Did I write that? When I started to write this story, I'd been thinking about something for a long time and growing up. And yes, I'm a white guy, but my background's Sicilian. So we were sort of like the trash of Europe when my grandparents came here. And they came from Sicily, which is thousands of years of history, but in the 1920s, we were Dagos. And we weren't allowed to be Italian or Sicilian then, so that's been suppressed. And we've lost that. So the migrants that came later, I think it's much more tolerant here to bring that culture with them, and we didn't have that, so I've lost the language, lost everything. And I kept thinking about something for a long time about the fair go, and you probably never open the newspaper of a weekend without Bernard Salt or someone talking about Australia being the society of the fair go. And I thought, what would an Indigenous Australian make of that? Yeah. What would someone locked up in Woomera, that was the detention centre years ago, Woomera or Villawood, what would they think? And it's almost like a form of gaslighting in that, where the country fair goes, so what have you got to complain about? And then I didn't know how to tell that story, but I just had a feeling that it wasn't quite right if you look around at the evidence. So then I came across this story, but what's interesting is that maybe the fair go didn't exist because these gentlemen didn't get a fair go at all. But the notion of the fair go existed. And even in the 1890s, Gunny Khan is writing letters to the editor of the Western Herald, the Burke newspaper, and he's saying, I'm not getting a fair go. I'm not getting fair play. And then other pastoralists and other people of Burke are writing in and saying, if we're British and we believe in the fair go, so we should be giving these people a chance to do their work. So it never existed, but the notion has been there. And I think at some point we may have just given up trying to make it real and just rest on our laurels that we are the nation of the fair go. But what are we doing every day to make that come true? And I don't think just because we don't achieve it, we should stop trying to achieve it, because it is a brilliant notion, but we can't just say it and not do it. And I think sometimes in our actions as a polity, as a nation, we don't follow through on it. We're just happy to talk about it. And I saw that with these gentlemen. Like, it was there from the very beginning, that notion. But did it exist them? I don't think so.
Well, certainly not in some of the ways that they were treated, both as individuals and as a group.
Well, particularly as the justice system. So you mentioned, I documented in here 5 murders, where each time the person was a British settler and was not just exonerated, but applauded out of jail.
The murderer, yeah.
Murderer. But at the time, the editorials in the newspapers were saying, how can this occur in a British court? This isn't right. So the notion that we should be doing better has always been there, but sometimes we just don't live up to it.
Yeah, thank you. So, when it comes to identity, what conclusions have you come to about what brings us together as people and what drives us apart?
This is really an interesting area that I found during COVID. Obviously, many of you might know by now that I live in Blacktown, and I've lived in Blacktown for a long time, and there's a chapter in my book called I'm a Blacktown Boy. So I've been sort of fascinated by Blacktown because when I was a child, I always wanted to work for the United Nations, and when I was looking for a property here, I thought, I could get very close to it by living in a place called Blacktown because, as you said, there are people from 188 different countries, and we speak 182 languages. But not only that, we need to learn about the history of this country, and we also are privileged to have the largest urban indigenous population in the country. We've got 11,000 indigenous population in Blacktown, so we were very rich that way. So if you look at the richness of Blacktown, we are very, very rich, and not many people see it that way. So what I found during COVID was we had a community leaders forum, and when panic hit, people were asking for, I need vaccination for my community. I need vaccination for my community. And I was thinking, what's my community? If I was really shivering that day because it was a crisis, and it was about life, not lifestyle. And when we start talking about my community and people are confining to their ethnic background or the religious background, what happens to that old, elderly person next to her who may not have anybody to lobby for them? And that was a very scary moment for us. And I said, we really need to set this conversation and start looking at what community are we talking about. If we do that way, we would be divided. And politicians sometimes cater to those whims and fancies. And there was even a temporary vaccination center set for one ethnic group. And I believe, they had, 2 or 3, nurses and so many staff. 8 people turned up. What a waste of money. What a waste of, there's anger and frustration in the community starts building up that way. So for me, I'm a Blacktown resident. First, I may have different identities. I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm from Bhutan, my, original nationality. I'm ethnic Nepali. I've got different identities, but what's the starting point? What's the base for me? I'm a Blacktown resident. I'm an Australian first. If we don't start with that identity, I found there's a lot of risk in us sort of really getting divided, and during crisis, it could lead to very unhappy situations. So for me, that's the starting point. How can we start on what's common? We all want, in a clean neighborhood. We all want a safe neighborhood. That's very common for all of us. So why couldn't we start on that commonality as neighbors and then add to the richness to that? We bring our differences, our diversity, our food, our culture, our everything else, as to the richness on top. But we have got that base, very strong base, as residents of Blacktown, as Australians, building on that, indigenous history that you talked about. I think that's where I want us to think about as Blacktown residents, I'm a Blacktown boy first. And then, we bring our diversity and adds to that richness, not the other way around.
Yeah, I love that. So, you were talking about the visibility of Sri Lankan Tamils in Australia. And I think your experiences in the publishing industry have sort of illustrate a bit about hopefully how things maybe are changing in a positive direction. Can you share about your experiences in the publishing industry in terms of your writing and getting to where you are now? And then I would just love to hear a little bit also about what the experience of having these two books come out in the same year in Australia has been like for you.
Okay, sure.
So difficult with one. I don't know how we manage that.
In the same way I manage 4 children, I neglect half of them. No, I just neglect half of them at any given time. So with the Song of the Sun God, people think you have positioned that incorrectly, AKB, because they did not both come out. They did both come out last year, but actually the reason they came out last year was because one was written many, many years ago. So I am not prolific. I didn't write and publish 2 books in 1 year. One book came out in 2017 in Sri Lanka. This is the story about 3 generations of Australian Tamil women, a story of dispossession, colonization, the forced migration, and the creation of home. This book, when I tried to publish it in Australia, I was told in 2013, that this was not an Australian story, that Australians wouldn't buy it, they wouldn't read it, and that therefore Australian publishers wouldn't publish it. So colonization, dispossession, forced migration, creation of home in a new country. What could be more Australian, or at least one of many Australian stories? And so this was enraging to me, but also a real repudiation of my place here. And it really made me grieve and feel vulnerable once again for who we are and how we're valued and whether or not we're valued in this country. Now, fast forward many years later, and that's why actually ultimately when I wrote Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens, a critique, it's a story about many things, but one of them is a critique of race and racism in Australia. I figured it would never get published. So I could just go for gold. I could write whatever I wanted to write in whatever way I wanted to write, because pretty much only my dad and my cousins were going to buy it. Or in fact read it, because it wasn't even going to get published. And so fast forward many years later, and I think through the advocacy of writers, many of whom are based in Western Sydney, Muhammad Ahmed, Winnie Dunn, Sweatshop, Maxine Beneba Clark, so on, Shirley Lay's new book. There's so many strong writers pushing hard, grappling with rejection, and just saying, you know what, we will not shut the F up. We will keep writing, and we will keep telling our stories, and we will keep telling them because they are Australian stories. And so that advocacy, I think, has really, and the advocacy of, in particular, small publishers. Ashley and I are published by the same publisher who then Ultimo started with Hachette, who've also published Maxine, Muhammad, and so on. It takes individuals who then become the publishers, who are the gatekeepers that are changing the face of what is getting through the gate. Because actually, I don't think the Australian readership has changed at all. I have enormous faith in the Australian readership. If I can read Emily Maguire and Ashley and Ryan, then of course you can read Shankari and Om, right? So I don't think the Australian readership has changed, but rather that the publishers and the gatekeepers' assessment of that and confidence of that is changing because they're seeing other books prove them wrong. And what was your other question? Oh, sorry.
Well, now that you've got them 2 out, yes, how's that been?
Look, it's been utterly remarkable and wonderful, and a real privilege to have two books out. And this book was really, Song of the Sun God was a book I wrote for my community and for my ancestral community. My responsibility and my duty to my ancestors and this community that had been through so much in Sri Lanka, but whose story would never be told because of the way that war ended and the politics of that country. And I was prepared to stop there, but as all writers know, once you start writing, you cannot stop. You just cannot stop. And so I kept going. So to have two books out and published, is a privilege and a miracle to me. And at the same time, mentally, like many writers, I've moved on in that I'm now we're all working on our next projects, right? Yeah, exactly. First thing, it's a bit like when you're Sri Lankan, you get married. As soon as you get married, you spend your whole life with your aunties asking you, when are you going to get married? Then they're like, when are you going to have children once you're married? So this is like, when are we going to have the next book? When's the next book? And that's what we've all moved on to doing.
Excellent, excellent.
Hopefully we don't get to ask when you get married again.
All right, so Ryan, a refrain you return to in the Ballad of Abdul Wade is a line from Henry Lawson. If you know Burke, you know Australia. And you write about how Lawson and historian Charles Bean had a huge role in shaping our current understanding of Australian identity. So tell us about your insights into the work of Lawson and Bean through your research into Abdul Wade and the Afghan cameleers.
So Henry Lawson went out to Burke in 1892. He went out there in September 1892. So last year was 100 years. They celebrated out there, had a big festival celebrating Lawson's time in Burke. There's two monuments to Lawson in the Burke Central Park. The exhibition centre, the big quote at the front is, if you know Burke, you know Australia. Lawson spent about 5 weeks in Burke. I think 4 of those he was drunk. He then walked to the Queensland border with his mate, tried to find some work in some shearing sheds, got fed up, went back to Burke and said, I'm never going back to the bush ever again. Hated it. He was teased badly. He was deaf in one ear, and he was in the shearing sheds, and he got bullied a lot as a city slicker. And it was only sort of about 10 years later when he started to write from London that he sort of created these myths about the mateship of the bush. But when he first came back, he did not like it at all. He did not like the people. But he did create these myths of mateship and the famous phrase, if you know Burke, you know Australia. But what I found was that Lawson only hung out with the unions. And the unions at that time were in open warfare with the camel men. And they were a small percentage of the population, and they weren't well liked by the rest of the population, the union members, because they were holding to ransom the towns. Basically, they said, if you use the camels to transport your wool, we will boycott you. We will not bring out your products from the train station. We will not cart your products. So it was a real threat, and there was up in Queensland during some flood times, Charleville got cut off completely, and they couldn't get supplies in or out. And the local newspaper said the situation was so dire that sobriety was breaking out in the town. And it was camels that eventually were sent off from Charleville to Hughenden to bring back supplies. And when the camel team got to Hughenden, nobody would sell them any supplies. And it went out that the union had said, if anyone sells this man supplies, they'll be boycotted. Even though they knew the food was going back to help other British settlers, they were so fearful of the competition of the Afghans and the camels. And it was because the camel was a better way of transport. They could walk through the floodwaters, so the bullock wagons couldn't, because their metal rims would sink in the mud, the red dirt. And they could go through drought because you didn't have to take feed for the camels. They'd just eat whatever was around, where you'd have to carry feed for the cattle or horses pulling your wagon. So they were a better form of transport. So when you hear Henry Lawson talking about ingenuity and resourcefulness, and Charles Bean did the same. He said, there's nothing the Australian bushman can't do. Well, he could never learn to drive the camel. And for 30 years, the largest breeder of camels in Australia was a white guy from Scotland. So it wasn't that you couldn't get camels. They just refused to use them. And if you read the papers, the people in Sydney are saying, what's wrong with the people of Burke if they're refusing to use the only possible means of transport for inland Australia? And they didn't pick it up. So the other big myth, I think, is the anti-authoritarianism. And if you look at the history of the Afghan settlement in Burke, The union was trying to get the parliament to change the laws. They wanted to ban camels from walking on main roads. They wanted to ban camels from 100 metres of the train station. So it wasn't, they were running to authority at every opportunity. And they even tried to get the Afghans pulled into court on cruelty to animal charges. And when they got into court, they realised that the Animal Cruelty Act had been written prior to 1840 when the first camel arrived. So under the law, they were able to prove that the camel wasn't an animal, which really set things off. But I just think that we've taken Henry Lawson. He was a journalist, or he went out there supposedly to write journalism. I think he went out there to dry out, which was unusual choice because at that time Burke had 30 pubs for a population of 3,000. So it didn't go well in terms of drying out. But we take Lawson's writing as white Australia, and it's not. And one of the things I really wanted to show in this book was that there were a lot of people in Burke who weren't racist, who supported the Afghans. They supported them against the unions because they were punctual, they were sober. They would say, we're going to be at your property in 5 weeks' time at midday on Tuesday, and they would arrive. They were resourceful. You never hear these stories of them perishing in the outback chasing gold. They moved through the country. They worked very well with indigenous populations to find where the water was, to find where the roots are. So it's quite ironic that the qualities that Lawson gave the white settlers of resourcefulness, ingenuity, mateship, the Afghan people had that. And in terms of that mateship type of sort of, or charity, I don't write about religion in here. I don't write about language or more sort of cultural elements because I wasn't familiar with that with the Afghan population. But every Friday at Burke, they would kill a beast halal style, and they'd provide it to the town, and they'd provide singing and dancing, and they'd give kids rides on the camels. They'd provide lollies and fruit for the people. So they had this real sense of community and mateship, which Lawson seemed to take from them because he never wrote about them in any positive terms, and put that onto the white union members who were actually slitting camels' throats. They were shooting camels. They were attacking the Afghan men. And they weren't very brave in the face of the Afghans. And there was like reporters said you'd go out to Burke and there'd be a group of 50 white men would happily attack an Afghan, but any two Afghans walking down the street together were completely safe.
Wow. Your book offers interesting insights into some of the less positive aspects of Australian life. Could you give us a couple examples of what you've noticed here, coming from outside Australia?
I think I've got lots and lots of it. To start with, I think when I first arrived here, everybody was so welcoming and so supportive. We go to university, there's a counselor who would sit with you and listen to you. I used to work at the checkout, and there used to be a long queue, where I was, and I had met so many friends, and they would want to go through my checkout. They would be other checkout would be wanty. One time, the manager comes in and says, "Can you go to that line?" And some of the elderly people refused to move. They wanted to say hello, and a lot of them knew my story, and they would ask, "How is Smriti doing?" That's my daughter. She was in Nepal, and my wife, and they knew some of the names and all that. So I think that was one of the best things that has happened to me when I worked on the checkout, or when I worked at a factory line. I used to work in an assembly line, and there was these two gentlemen from a Syrian background, and they'll say, "Oh, not Syria, it's Assyrian." So I knew the difference between Syrian and Assyrian, so I'm very respectful. They find it very disrespectful if you say Syrian. So they were there on two sides, and sometimes I had to put a screw when the line came in, and my eyesight are pretty bad, and sometimes I'll miss that, and then they would actually stuff the whole line if you don't do it properly. So they would smile and help me, and just wave at me, and so I found that's real Australia. And I'm more an experiential person. I tend to sort of believe what I've experienced, not what I read. And that's the same thing happened when I was moving to Blacktown as well. I used to work at Telstra, and my friends were worried, are you okay, Om? You're living in Blacktown. And they had never been there, but they had read and heard about that. So I think my experience about Australia has been I think, shaped by some of those, interactions that I had. And during COVID, I think that was another moment where I was looking for some, test kit for my mom. My elderly mom is turning 93 in a couple of weeks' time. And during COVID, we needed a test kit, and it was out of market. And I was panicking, and somebody said, why don't you put it on our resident Facebook page? And within an hour, there were 3 people knocking the door and said, hey, I've left test kit. We couldn't talk to each other. It was sort of, the lockdown time. And they left, within an hour, I had all these unknown people leaving test kits outside my house. And that's Australia, I think. I just want us to focus on what's, we're doing well, what's working well, how can we focus on that, do more of it? And that's the approach I think we can take and make this beautiful country. I think it's the best country in the world. We continue to improve it. There are areas where we can improve. We should always aspire to improve it. But I think my belief is that there's so much working in this community. There are so many nice people in this country. We just have to nurture them and help build our community, build community champions where we can look after each other.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to ask 2 more questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So just giving you your warning now. So you know this story well. My great-grandparents were Armenian genocide survivors, and they ended up in a small Armenian community in Canada in 1920. So their children spoke Armenian, and some of their grandchildren spoke Armenian, but not my father. And that means I was completely cut off from my Armenian heritage. So I know you've explored this challenge of how you raise kids in a country where they're separated from their ancestral homeland. Can you talk about how you've incorporated that into your stories?
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. I think, I think I said initially, part of writing this story, the first audience for Song of the Sun God was initially my children, and then it became something more that I wanted to share with everybody. And so I've tried really hard to remember everything that every family member and every community member within our ancestral community has told me, and to almost create a record of that, which is not to say that it's a really boring read, people. It's a really fascinating read.
It is.
It tries to hold our communal memory and culture and religion and our stories. So much of culture is passed down through the actual language, which I don't have, right? So my parents are trilingual, so they speak English fluently. They were educated in English, and they speak Tamil and Sinhalese fluently. But when they came here, they wanted us to integrate, whilst retaining our culture, but to integrate through language. And in their own country, if you spoke Tamil, at times your life could be in danger. And so they had learned to code switch very effectively. And as a result, we have no language. And this is something that still gives me enormous grief, because I can understand a lot of Tamil, but I can't speak it. So it's almost like I can feel the language and sense it without being able to construct it in my brain and in my mouth adequately. And in fact, when I do, the language is thousands of years old, and the speakers are extremely proud of it. So when I do try to speak Tamil, they're like, please don't. So I've tried to record it here as a gift to my children, but as almost as, in order to embolden and strengthen them and give them tools from the richness of their heritage that helps them go into the future, right? Into the masala. You know what a masala is? The modern masala of Australian culture, and the modern masala of the Australian, the future that we're trying to create. And in fact, the masala of the world, because the world is different now from what it used to be. But I want them to remember that culture and that history and religion and spirituality and stories will help them.
Thank you. Ryan, you've already been alluding to this, but I want to go into it directly. Part of our national identity, any national identity, comes from a shared understanding of our history. So what did researching and writing the Ballad of Abdul Wade teach you about Australian history, how it's taught and understood?
That's very selective. I did primary school, I did high school, I lived in the area, did a few university degrees. I'd never heard of this story. It was completely new to me. And I've been around doing a lot of talks once the books came out, and very few people know this story of the Afghans. And they were such a huge contribution. I mean, when I was doing the research, I went into Trove, which is where Australia's newspapers are all stored digitally. And the amount of articles between 1890 and 1910 about these men, they were everywhere. Like, they were just a central part of there were thousands of Afghan, Indian and modern Pakistan people here. And they were men because the women didn't come out. So we lose that. And so I learnt that writing is so important, recording history, film is so important, because I think if you went back and spoke to someone from that time and you said in 100 years' time nobody's going to know who Abdul Wade was, they'd be like, well, that can't be possible. He's the one, he owned a giant mansion on Sydney Cove. He was a regular at Royal Randwick. He was in the papers. He was hosting diplomatic visits on Australian Navy boats. And 100 years later, nobody's ever heard of him. And what is written about him is incorrect. So I learnt that history is very much changeable, that what we believe today might not be what's recorded 50 years from now, which is so important. It's so important that people can be writing, that people are out buying books so people can be writing and pursuing this career. And I learnt that the voices that supported Abdul and the Afghans were completely lost. And the voices that remained were the enemies, I suppose. And there were some very important enemies that he had. One person started out as the editor of the Burke newspaper and ended up becoming the acting Prime Minister of Australia. He was one of our first senators. And he had the privilege of founding the anti-Afghan movement with Charles Dickens' son in Burke. And then a couple of years later, he was the head of the Afghan Defence Fund. So he was a really complete, sort of a conniving politician. But his biography makes no mention of this. And he was the first man who brought the White Australia policy into Parliament in New South Wales. So we had a federal White Australia policy in 1901. New South Wales had a White Australia policy in 1898. There was something else I didn't know about until I read this. But the man who brought it in was the first senator in our federal parliament. There's nothing that he did that. There's nothing recorded that he did that. And when I finished writing the book, I wrote to the Australian Dictionary of Biography, and I wrote to the parliamentary biography, because this man was Minister of Defence, first senator, was acting Prime Minister. And I said, look, I've discovered all this information about this gentleman. Can we update his biography? And this is the repository of Australia's biographical information of important Australians, or eminent Australians, I think it says. And their response was, we're happy to correct errors, but we will not add to people's biographies. And that, to me, is that how we think about history? That we don't want to learn, we don't want to know? And if you read what this man did, and then we have an institutional denial of that, or an unwillingness to record it, I think that says more about us than what it actually does about him and the things he did. How we remember him reflects on us, and what he did reflects on him. So I think it's important that we get as close to the facts as possible. This isn't a definitive. I mean, I did my best, but there is so much more to be written about these people, and I think history is about getting closer to the truth. And so I hope I've put a footstep ahead and someone else will come along and do more. But we need to be able to confront that. And I think when we do accept the full truth of our history, we become richer for it. Like, what a great country if we can have all these stories of Indigenous Australians, of immigration, of white settlers, of non-white settlers, of the Chinese. Like, the Chinese were on the fringe of this story the whole way, the market gardens, and there are so many other stories out there. It just makes us richer if we actually know them and acknowledge them and celebrate them.
And that issue of what history is told and what history is denied is a factor in all of our stories as well. So that's a really great point to wrap up on. So now we're going to go to artists' questions.
Can I just add something to it? Because I thought this is really interesting, and I was overwhelmed when I heard this. Rosina is one of the publicists at UNSW Press who's published my book. And last week she said, my daughter, Olivia, is making a speech at school, and she's talking about refugee settlement and how this should be done based on your book. So I think the power of book, and what we pass on to our children, I think that's so fantastic that you wrote this book, and I learned so much from your book, and I said, wow, there's so much we need to learn every day and what we can pass on to our children. So I think I can not emphasize the power of books.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you to everyone here who is supporting books. Now, I see a very eager hand up right in the back. Someone, he's had his hand up since before Om started talking. So the copy of How to Be Australian is definitely yours. Please let us know who your question is directed to.
To all three, actually. So you talked a bit about COVID and how sort of people became tribal a little bit, and I was just interested in your view now that we're facing another crisis, which is the housing crisis. So there's issues where I think in our communities people are now pushing back on migration, they're pushing back on privilege. There's a whole range of dynamics going on. And Blacktown being such a dynamic and growing area, it's a centrepiece for the West going out and buildings going up. I'd just like your comments on, well, what sort of buildings are going to be going up? We've got the government that just wants to put up high rises 15, 16 stories high. But how does that fit communities which are so diverse and they all have different ways of how they like to live when they come here? So not everyone wants to live in a unit or on a quarter acre, but you have such a diverse mix of people. So how does the community as a full group work with that and tell governments, no, we're not going to put up 30-storey buildings next to the train station there just to suit their goal of housing people in a box?
Thoughts on housing in Blacktown? And
Yeah, I might give our own example. Like, a lot of people have heard stories that, migrants create housing problem or refugees add to the housing problem. Being conscious of that, one of the things we did was we should not be, our first aim was when people started arriving, our first aim was when are we all getting out of settling benefit? Of course, I came in earlier, but people who were settled here as refugees, first objective was when do we all as a community come out of settling benefit? So with that in mind, we developed a model, and I've sort of covered a little bit of it in my book as well, what I call it a strength-based model for refugee settlement, to just not to add further pressure on the existing problems and issues. We thought buying a home would be a good outcome for us. So by adopting a strength-based model, it's a bottom-up strength-based model, we started focusing on people's passion and strengths. When I receive somebody at the airport, the first thing is, hey, what did you do in the camp? What's your passion? What are you interested in? What strengths do you bring in? It's not about what you need. Because when we ask people what you need, then there is so much we all need at any given point in time, and it's not very inspiring. So by adopting that strength-based, bottom-up strength-based approach, we have been able to help people to sort of, first get some training and education, to get a job, and then develop that borrowing capacity and buy a house. So as a result of, in short, I think I can say that as a result of adopting that approach, over 70% of families in the Bhutanese community who are settled as refugees have been able to buy a house. So we are trying to do our best in terms of how do we, help ourselves so that we don't contribute to a problem in this country, rather be a solution. So our house ownership within our community is slightly above the national average now. So that's our contribution to housing. And I think that's all we can do as communities. How do we try and help our communities to not to contribute to further problems? So housing is just one problem there.
now, any thoughts on that question, or because I'd like to get to a couple more audience questions, but if you have thoughts.
I'm completely unqualified for that.
Me too. I mean, the only, having said I'm unqualified, I'll just put some words around that. I think that and I know this is not what you're saying, I think this idea that refugees and migrants, or at least migrants from refugee communities, is a big driver to the housing bubble in Australia. Yeah, I know you're not saying that at all. I know that, absolutely. But I think that's a very convenient, I hear that, and you think, well, that's a very convenient red herring and discussion piece driven by something completely different to address. That's right, yeah, that's exactly it. And it's to address, to sort of almost, look over here to keep us distracted from the systemic issues at play there. And so in saying also that I don't know, I am really deeply concerned, right? We have 4 children, skin in the game. I don't know what the future of housing in this country is, but it's terrifying.
question right up here at the front. Oh, there's a mic. There you are.
I visited Bhutan in 2005, and it was a fantastic experience. And I never heard anything about the ethnic cleansing. It was always gross national happiness. And it was only when I saw you on television fairly recently that I thought, why are Bhutan people refugees in Australia? It's such a wonderful, happy country. And I wonder if you could tell the audience slightly what the ethnic cleansing was about.
I think we did talk a little bit about identity, and I think that's one of the crux of the problem here, I think, because during the late 80s and early 90s, when the Berlin Wall fell down and, all the democratic movements started happening around the world, perhaps it's a kingdom, for those of you who don't know, it was almost a queendom because the king had married four sisters, so, 4 queens and 1 king. So during that time, I'm sure people around the king may have felt, the, danger or threat of what happens if democracy came into Bhutan as well. So some sort of fear was put into the king and said, we got to do something about it. And I think the government as a whole adopted the wrong policy of divide and rule. And because the northern Bhutanese, eastern and western Bhutanese are bound by a common religion, Buddhism, and the southern Bhutanese of Nepali ethnicity are Hindus, they thought it convenient to sort of separate these, ethnic Nepalis, and decided to evict 1/7 of the country's population. So, out of 750,000 or so population, the government made a conscious decision of evicting people from the country and continue with the slogan of gross national happiness. And because it's so controlled, not many people know about it. So that's where I've asked a question in my book also, the king was our king. We all were loyal subjects. I was, working for the government, head of the planning and development. I was part of that, building the country. But the king perhaps decided to identify himself as the king of the northern Bhutanese and took that narrow identity, and he had to protect those northern Bhutanese at any cost, so by evicting or killing or throwing away the northern Bhutanese. So my conclusion is that he took that narrow identity of being king of the northern Bhutanese only and his own subjects, and that's what's happened now. So I'm really conscious of how we grow in this country as well, taking that narrow identity and empowering people or leaders with that narrow identity could be very, very dangerous, and that's something we need to be conscious of in our country as well.
Thank you so much, and thank you for those questions. And we're out of time, and you can tell just by how fascinating each of these speakers have been, how much more interesting their books will be when you get really in-depth into their minds and their thoughts and their experiences. If you like Pachinko, Song of the Sun God is definitely for you. That's a definite resonance there. So please grab a copy of their books, get them signed, say hello, and thank you again so much for being here, and to everyone at the Words on the Waves team. We really appreciate you doing all the work to put this festival on.